On December 2, 2025, a high-level American delegation touched down in Moscow, stepping into a city bracing for a pivotal moment in modern diplomacy. The world watched as the U.S. diplomats, faces set with determination, disembarked onto Russian soil, aware that the stakes had rarely been higher. Their destination: a tense, marathon 5-hour meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin inside the storied halls of the Kremlin. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, as both sides prepared for what could be a turning point in the ongoing conflict. This was no routine diplomatic exchange. Instead, it was a last-ditch, high-stakes effort to end the brutal, 4-year war that had ravaged Ukraine, leaving cities in ruins and millions displaced. The world's eyes were fixed on Moscow, hoping for a glimmer of peace. Leading the American side were Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, both tasked with navigating the thorniest issue on the table: Ukraine's potential NATO membership. This question had become the central fault line in East-West relations. Russia's 2022 invasion had shattered the illusion of European peace, unleashing a humanitarian catastrophe and prompting an unprecedented, united response from the West. The conflict had redrawn the map of Europe and upended global security. Despite punishing sanctions and staggering battlefield losses, Moscow pressed on with its campaign. Meanwhile, Ukraine, bolstered by Western military and humanitarian aid, mounted a fierce and determined resistance, refusing to yield. Now, with front lines largely static and casualties mounting on both sides, the war had reached a grinding stalemate. For many, diplomacy had become the only remaining hope to break the deadlock and prevent further suffering. Yet, after hours of intense negotiation, the Moscow meeting ended without a breakthrough. The deep divide between the U.S., its allies, Ukraine, and Russia was laid bare for all to see, with neither side willing to budge on core demands. Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov confirmed that no compromise had been reached, especially on the most contentious issues: Ukraine's future geopolitical alignment and the fate of Russian-occupied territories in the east and south. President Trump, addressing reporters afterward, called the meeting reasonably good, but cautioned that it takes two to tango. His words reflected both hope and frustration at the slow pace of progress. Both sides are still talking, but their goals remain fundamentally at odds. The Americans insist on a just and lasting peace for Ukraine, one that respects its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The U.S. and its allies envision a future where Ukraine is free to choose its own path, supported by international aid and security guarantees, and where the suffering of ordinary Ukrainians finally comes to an end. Russia, on the other hand, demands ironclad security guarantees and insists on a neutral Ukraine, free from Western military alliances, a position it sees as non-negotiable for its own security. The Moscow talks underscored just how far apart the two sides remain, and how difficult the road to peace will be. For now, the world waits, hoping that dialogue can still prevail over war. NATO, founded in 1949, is a military alliance built on the principle of collective defense, meaning that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all. This core idea, enshrined in Article 5 of its founding treaty, was designed to deter aggression and foster unity among its members. Originally, NATO was formed to counter the growing influence and military power of the Soviet Union during the tense years of the Cold War. Over the decades, as the world changed, so did NATO. The alliance expanded its reach, welcoming new members from the former Eastern Bloc and adapting to new security challenges. NATO's open-door policy means that any European state willing and able to meet its standards can apply for membership. This policy has been a cornerstone of the alliance, symbolizing its commitment to growth and inclusivity. For many countries, especially those in Eastern Europe that once lived under Soviet influence, joining NATO represents the ultimate security guarantee. It's a powerful symbol of protection and a step toward integration with the West. But NATO membership is about more than just military protection. It also signals a commitment to shared values: democracy, the rule of law, and economic stability. These principles are at the heart of what it means to be part of the alliance. The path to membership is not easy. Applicants must undergo significant reforms, from modernizing their militaries to strengthening democratic institutions. Every current member must agree before a new country can join, making the process both rigorous and highly political. In 2023, Ukraine's path to NATO was streamlined, reflecting the urgency of its security needs. Yet, an official invitation still depends on the consensus of all member states, each weighing the risks and benefits. Today, NATO's open-door policy is at the very heart of the Ukraine conflict. For Kyiv, joining NATO is seen as a lifeline and a shield against further aggression. For Moscow, however, it's a red line, one that it claims threatens its own security. NATO's promise to Ukraine is strong, and support is visible, but the exact timing and conditions for membership remain uncertain. The alliance must balance its principles with the realities of geopolitics. As the world watches, the future of the alliance, and the security of Europe itself, hangs in the balance, shaped by decisions made in the coming months and years. For Ukraine, NATO membership is about survival, not just strategy. Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea and the 2022 invasion turned public opinion decisively pro-NATO. Kyiv sees Article 5 as the only real deterrent against future Russian attacks. Past security assurances, like the Budapest Memorandum, failed to protect Ukraine. NATO membership is now enshrined in Ukraine's constitution and drives sweeping reforms. Despite war, Ukraine has deepened cooperation with NATO, integrating its military and institutions. For Ukrainians, joining NATO is about securing their future and breaking free from Russia's shadow. For the Kremlin, Ukraine joining NATO is an existential threat. Putin frames NATO's expansion as a betrayal and a direct challenge to Russian security. The idea of NATO forces on Russia's border is a red line Moscow won't cross. Russia's invasion was justified as a preemptive move to stop NATO's advance and enforce Ukrainian neutrality. The Kremlin demands legally binding guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO. Beyond security, Russia sees Ukraine as part of its historical sphere of influence. Preventing Ukraine's NATO membership is central to Russia's strategy and non-negotiable. The world is deeply divided over Ukraine's NATO ambitions. Putin insists Ukraine must remain neutral, making it a precondition for peace. Zelensky, meanwhile, calls NATO membership Ukraine's only true security guarantee. For Kyiv, joining the alliance is a sovereign right and a necessity. NATO itself is split. Secretary General Mark Rutte says the door is open, but there's no consensus among members. Some allies, especially in Eastern Europe, push for Ukraine's accession. Others fear escalation with Russia. The U.S., under Trump, now opposes Ukraine's membership, a major shift from past policy. Hungary openly criticizes support for Ukraine, deepening alliance divisions. These conflicting positions make a unified path forward elusive. The diplomatic dance continues, but the stakes remain dangerously high. Under President Trump, the U.S. has dramatically shifted its stance on Ukraine's NATO bid. Trump's administration has ruled out Ukrainian membership, aligning more with Russia's demands than Kyiv's hopes. This reversal has alarmed Ukraine and many European allies, who question America's commitment to NATO's open door. The rationale: avoiding direct conflict with Russia and prioritizing U.S. interests. Trump argues that extending Article 5 to Ukraine risks endless war. The absence of Secretary of State Rubio from recent NATO meetings signaled this new direction. The U.S. now sees Ukraine's NATO aspirations as negotiable, deepening rifts within the alliance. At the heart of the conflict lies a zero-sum dilemma. For Ukraine, joining NATO is not just a political goal, but a matter of national survival and security. For Russia, however, NATO's eastward expansion is seen as an existential threat, a red line that cannot be crossed without dire consequences. These opposing worldviews have created a chasm that is difficult to bridge. In Kyiv, the idea of neutrality is equated with surrendering to Russian pressure, while in Moscow, any further NATO expansion is viewed as a humiliating defeat that undermines Russian influence and security. Both sides have staked not only their political futures, but also their national identities and legitimacy on these positions, leaving almost no room for meaningful compromise or flexibility. The territorial dispute only deepens the deadlock. Russia insists on retaining control over annexed regions, while Ukraine refuses to cede any land, viewing it as a betrayal of its sovereignty and people. Any Ukrainian leader who even considers giving up territory or abandoning the hope of NATO membership would face massive public outrage, risking political collapse or worse. Even if the question of neutrality could somehow be negotiated, the issue of territory remains a major, perhaps insurmountable obstacle to peace. These are not just abstract policy differences, they are deeply personal, tied to questions of national survival, identity, and the future of millions of people caught in the crossfire. A genuine compromise would require one side to abandon its most fundamental war aims, something neither is prepared to do. As of late 2025, both sides remain entrenched, unwilling to make the painful concessions needed for peace. Negotiations repeatedly end in stalemate, while the war continues to grind on, exacting a heavy toll on both nations. For now, the diplomatic deadlock appears unbreakable, and the path to compromise remains as distant as ever. The Ukraine-NATO debate is about more than one country. It's about Europe's entire security order. If Russia can dictate Ukraine's alliances by force, it sets a dangerous precedent for the continent. Eastern European nations see Ukraine's fight as their own, fearing they could be next. For them, NATO's open door is a matter of sovereignty and survival. The war has forced Europe to boost defense spending and cut reliance on Russian energy. NATO's unity has been tested but also revitalized by the crisis. The outcome will shape Europe's future, either reinforcing the rules-based order or inviting further aggression. As 2025 ends, peace remains elusive and fragile. The Moscow talks kept dialogue alive but failed to bridge the core divides: NATO membership and occupied territories. Russia demands Ukrainian neutrality. Ukraine, backed by allies, refuses to yield. The war of attrition continues, with both sides hoping battlefield gains will strengthen their negotiating hand. Some predict a frozen conflict, others hope for a diplomatic breakthrough. The U.S. role is pivotal. Pressure on Ukraine to compromise could fracture the Western alliance. For now, the quest for peace is uncertain, and Ukraine's fate, and Europe's security, hangs in the balance. The world watches, hoping for a resolution that remains just out of reach.